CJ, you good?
Yep.
Great. So good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning and to introduce my good friend Brian Snyder. For a decade or more, as I'm going to national policy conversations and meetings around the country, I've kept running into Brian, and we keep talking, and we've basically come to some major points of agreement. That is, MOFGA is a little better organization than PASA, but PASA is closer to DC. I think that's how it's all about. But Brian probably has a little different perspective on that agreement, and he'll share that at some point along the way. Brian and I have kind of launched ourselves into the middle of several policy conversations over the last few years, and along the way we've realized that one of the things that's missing in Washington is your voice. Not just your voice individually, but the voice of people like you around the country. That so much of what happens in Washington is, in a sense, prearranged by historical traditions. And I haven't read Brian's talk yet. I should look through it really quickly here. But I think I have a sense of where we're going, and it's really that if we're going to change foreign policy, if we're going to change food policy, it's going to take all of your voices. So I'm really pleased to welcome my good friend Brian Snyder, and welcome aboard.
Well, yeah, I do have a little different version of things than what Russell put out there. But actually, the truth is, and we're here to tell the truth, right? The truth is that PASA and MOFGA are perhaps the two most significant sustainable ag organizations in the country. And that is one reason why Russell and I have become such good friends, and why we also see it as our responsibility to stay in this conversation about what are we going to do for the future. Because, getting it done in Maine is a challenge. Getting it done in Pennsylvania is an even bigger challenge, because we are what some people think of as the Iowa of the East Coast. But yeah, that is funny, but not really. But the fact is that we know that getting it done in Maine and getting it done in Pennsylvania is not really what we're trying to do. We're trying to get it done in the whole country and ultimately around the world. And in order to do that, we know that PASA and MOFGA are going to have to lead the way. And that's partly what I'm talking about today, but I hope that there's a few surprises in here for even Russell. So this is an incredible time. And something, this is, the things that are happening now in food systems and agriculture, something that many of us have dreamed of for a long time. The opportunities that are coming our way are just amazing. There are conferences all around the country that gather 1,000, 2,000 people. Our February conference has had over 2,000 people the last 2 years, and I think Congresswoman, you're heading out to a community food security conference out west as soon as you finish up here, and I think they're going to have 1,000 people or so out there. The Moses conference, of course. So there's stuff happening. Things are happening. They're happening in Washington. But there's a lot of bad news that we hear every day about the environment, about public health, about what's happening overseas and the way our country interacts with the rest of the world. And there's plenty of bad news out there, but inside of that, there's a lot of really good stuff happening, and we've worked hard for this. But there's a lot of work left to do, and we, like I said at the outset, we do need to organize better. We do need to bring the message to a larger audience all the time. And while we understand that some good things are happening, we only dimly understand what it is really going to take to complete the transformation that we envision. Success is by no means certain. There's peril everywhere, and very significant money is being spent as we speak to assure our failure. As some of you probably have seen emails about the new organization called the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, who are pledging to spend $30 million a year to restore the good reputation of farms. Well, I don't think we have to restore good reputations of farms in this room, do we? And I don't know where they get the idea that farmers' reputations are going down. It's really the companies that depend on the cheap raw materials that they get from those farms that are losing their reputation, and they're the ones that are spending the money to try to shore up the status quo. So this provides a little bit of context for my talk. I think that this is the beginning of a conversation. We need to be talking about what it's going to take for the future and what farmers need to do right now in order to formulate this message and get it across to a wider audience. And so I've got 5 basic things that I'm going to say that we have to do. Okay, and I'm going to be as clear about that as possible. But I do also need to be clear about the fact that this is a Sunday morning, and you have brought in a person who has a theology degree on a Sunday morning. So, you know, be warned. Because I'm going to start in the beginning. You know, what must farmers do right now to serve their communities and save the world? We have to remember where we came from. And this is a little document that was written some time ago that has something to do with where we came from. This is a little poem that's in Genesis about the fall. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you. You will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. Now, most people hear this at funerals, but this is actually the statement in the Bible that explains that our punishment for screwing up way back then is that we must farm. Now, folks, I'll remind you, I am a trained theologian. Don't try this at home. But there's a lot of credibility to that statement, that really, this is right at the beginning, this is the statement that farming is inherent to what it means to be human. And in fact, it's sort of the curse that we start with. Now, I'm going to come back to that idea of curse. But if you can think about the history of civilization, everything that's happened as being a response to this. And if you think about it, if everything that's happened in the world was in responding to this, we might see a culture that has mechanized agriculture to the greatest extent possible so that it requires the least amount of labor. And we would see most people running for the hills and trying to get away from farms and stay disconnected from their food because of this curse. That's what we have. And you can interpret the whole history of civilization as being a response to this, to try to overcome this curse that we must farm. Now, in this country, there's another important source of where we're from that I always like to make sure that we remember, and this is a little longer quote. This is one from one of my favorite writers. He's a theologian, he's an attorney, and he's an American Indian. He died a few years ago, but Vine Deloria Jr. was basically the attorney that stood behind the American Indian movement in the 70s. He's the one that provided the philosophical basis for what happened back then. And so I'm going to read this. I'm not going to read a whole lot to you, but I think it's worth hearing his words. Civilized life precludes most of the fundamental experiences that our species once had in relating to lands and the natural order. The old traditional Indians were in tune with the rhythms of life. They were accustomed to bringing in and relating to a whole picture of the land, the plants, and the animals around them. They responded to things as a part of a larger whole, which was a subjective reality to them. We could say that traditional Indians stood in the center of a circle and brought everything together in that circle. Today we stand at the end of a line and work our way along that line, discarding or avoiding everything on either side of us. And you know, I really, having some very good friends who are Native Americans, I despise the way we sometimes overly sentimentalize the experience of Indians in this country. But this is written by one of the foremost writers, one of the foremost philosophers, like I said, of the American Indian movement. And I think we can take this at face value, that there's something that was lost when settlers came into this land and started taking the land at will. And that something is something that we are charged with regaining in this movement. And I think we need to remember that that's another important part of where we came from. So what else must farmers do right now? We need to identify, reinforce, and stick to our essential values and strengths. Now this is going to be a little elementary for you all, and I'm going to show a few slides that I use when I'm talking to groups that don't know as much about sustainable agriculture. But I thought it would be a good way to kind of get some language out there. In my mind, there are 4 characteristics of a healthy food system, and a lot of these are going to be very familiar to you, but maybe there'll be some surprises here. Sustainable agriculture, you've probably heard about it referred to as a triple bottom line, and that is that when we're thinking about sustainable farming, which is a broader category than just organic farming, I think one of the major contributions that Michael Pollan has made to our movement is to make clear that, that you can transition to organic and we can have organic foods, but not necessarily all of the organic movement is also sustainable. And we need to think about the bigger picture, which includes a lot of other production systems. But a sustainable farming system includes economic viability as a high priority, environmental protection, and social responsibility. And it's only where those 3 things intersect, it's only in that place where they come together and all 3 are represented, that we can talk about what sustainable agriculture is. So there's nothing new in that to you, but of course we all are on kind of aware all the time about how people try to reduce this idea and just to include, you know, like in hotels we will see a placard that I think is basically saying, hey, you help us lay off a few more housekeeping staff and we'll save some animals in a tropical zone for you. You know, there's lots of greenwashing out there. And they're not, when they're using the word sustainable, they're not necessarily bringing this whole picture into focus for themselves or for the products that they're bringing to you. There are also some key concepts in sustainable ag, and I'm not going to read these because I think you're familiar with them. I'll just briefly say that diversity is probably the word that deserves to come up first every time we're talking about sustainable agriculture. And that's diversity of crops, it's diversity of farms, it's diversity of markets, it's diversity of customers. Diversity all through the system is key. It's something that helps us to manage risk, and it's something that helps us to maintain the whole vision of what we're trying to do. Certainly balance, and there's economics, environment, and ethics again. Regeneration, you know, our farmers, and I'm sure you all feel this way, you want to leave your farm, your land better than you found it. We're not just trying to maintain status quo, we're trying to bring it back. We want to continuously improve. We never achieve our objectives and then we're done. There's always more to do. And in some sense, we are discovering an alignment in what we do in our work and in our lives. And for some, that might be a religious purpose. For others, it's just having a clear set of goals for what you're trying to achieve on your farm and what we're trying to achieve in the food system. So these are concepts that you're all familiar with, and I don't need to spend a lot of time on. So, so one characteristic is sustainable, but another characteristic is local, and that's a word that's being overused even more than sustainable these days. And I thought we'd talk about local a little bit, at least in the way that I look at it, and I'm hoping maybe this will be a little different perspective for you. So who knows what that is? Everybody shout it out. What's the white outline? That's the Chesapeake Bay watershed. That's where most of our work is inside the white boundary. Of course, we cover the whole state of Pennsylvania. It's very significant to understand that watershed it covers 7 states, or there are 7 states that intersect with the watershed somewhere. It's one of the reasons why it's so difficult for us to figure out how to save that watershed and save the Chesapeake Bay and eliminate the dead zone that is forming down there. But here's a radical idea that I got from one of the keynoters at our conference a few years ago. What if we thought of a food shed and watershed as one and the same thing? What if we were looking at this and saying, now that's not only our watershed, but that's our food shed too? And that idea I got from Vern Sweeney of the Stroud Water Research Center in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And he had come to our conference and was so amazed at what was going on there that this was one of those times when he literally tore up his speech and he stayed up all night rewriting another speech around this concept. In a natural system, he said that food systems and food sheds and watersheds are the same thing. It's only in the sort of unnatural elements that we bring to it, highways and all kinds of transportation systems and the way people move around these days, that we have broken that down. And he was talking about regaining the concept of understanding the watershed. So let's look at that watershed. And I would invite you to do this with your own watersheds. There's a natural kind of development. There's a natural structure to the watershed. This is a resource map. And you'll see the pink areas around the top of the bay, and of course you all would recognize that as the heavily populated regions around Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and everything in between. But look at that, it's like the beating heart of that watershed. And then as you go out, the yellow is croplands. That's where the bulk of the food is being raised, and as you go out even further, the green are the forests and all the resources that those provide. And you can look at almost any watershed and you're going to see this same basic structure. But when you look at it this way, you understand why it's important that Jim Crawford, who was here yesterday, why it's important that he developed a cooperative of organic farmers, and they collect organic food basically throughout those yellow areas up in Pennsylvania, and they take it down into the pink areas. And you'll understand why people in southern New York need to be concerned about the people who live down in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, why there's a natural link there, and why the folks that live down in those cities need to be concerned about what's happening up on the farms in southern New York. It's very difficult to make that point any other way, because people in New York are frankly tired of being told what to do with their part of our watershed. And we have a lot of money being spent to protect the rights of farmers to continue doing whatever the hell they want to do in Pennsylvania too. There's a lot of good stuff that's happening, but it's very, very contentious. But when you look at it this way, you start to understand that this is an organism. This is an organism that we are united in needing to care for, even though we come from 7 different states. So here's a kind of a fun idea. I don't know if anybody knows what this is. Maybe one of our visitors in the front row knows what this is. But these are congressional districts. And you can have fun looking at some of these. Look down here around Pittsburgh. You see the yellow? I think this is probably John Murtha's old district. And you start to see how some of these districts are constructed in order to maintain, sometimes maintain the votes to stay in office, or maybe to connect different industries that are involved. I actually used this slide when I was speaking at Cornell last year, and if you look up at Ithaca there, look at that congressional district. There's a little slice that runs up and catches Ithaca, and then it goes down to the border and then runs over, and it's and most of it is over, more in southeast New York. So there's some comical things here, and you wonder, well, what are they representing? What is a person in a district that looks like that? What are they representing? And then I raise the question: here's a map of watersheds, and this is a little broader than Chesapeake Bay. This includes the Delaware River and Hudson. Those are natural boundaries. Those exist on the land. What if congressional districts were based on the basic structure of the underlying watersheds? What if you combine those according to population, because of course you have to balance population in districts, but what if that was the map that we started with and we built our congressional? What if congressional districts were always built on the concept of protecting and defending the watershed and thereby also the food shed where they come from. I'm going to be pretty old when this is implemented, so we're going to be counting on you all to take that idea forward. But you know, it also is very local. This is my watershed. This is the view off my front porch. In central Pennsylvania, that's my garden. I have actually two, one to the left and one to the right. They're both about 4,000 square feet. But look across the street, my neighbor, that's an orchard over there. If you look all the way over to the left, you're going to see a chicken tractor over there. That's my organic neighbor who provides our Thanksgiving turkey. Looking forward to that. And they run a CSA there. I mean, literally, this is my watershed, and this is my food shed, and this is how I think all of us ultimately need to think about where our food's coming from and how it's connected to the water. So the next thing is safe, another characteristic of a healthy food system. And I'm not going to talk about this a great deal, except to say that you know, Russell and I didn't do all that work for nothing. And I hope you have all taken the opportunity to thank Russell for the work that he did on the food safety bill that passed last year. And I want to take an opportunity right now and recognize, because Russell was the first one in. He was the first one that went down to Washington, and then he called me and said, hey, I think you better come along. But that food safety bill is drastically different than what it would have been, except for the fact that he went down there, then he dragged me, and then we dragged other people, and then pretty soon we had a group from all across the country. We cannot give up. And there's a lot of talk, particularly in Pennsylvania, about our rights and the fact that the government has no right to come into our farms and talk about what's safe and what's not safe, and they have no right to create regulations. You know what? I don't know about all that. There's different opinions on that, and there certainly has to be some balance. But I'll tell you this, we cannot give up the concept of safe food on our farms. That has to be our #1 priority. Everything that we do has to be directed toward providing healthy, nutritious, and safe food for our customers, because that really is our natural, strength, and it's something that the other side would love to be able to say is their natural strength, and it's not. You know, safety is founded in the concepts of transparency, traceability, and accountability, and that is what our movement represents. When you know the farmer where your food is coming from, you can go visit the farm, you can ask him or her about how it's produced. These three concepts come through in a way that they never will through the industrial food system. And I'll just say that, so this is my slide on safety. This is my wife and I at our farmer's market, and that's our farmer that we buy meat from. And you can see that he's got freezers up in the back of his pickup truck there. He brings it frozen and plugs those freezers in as soon as he gets to the farmer's market, takes it right out of there. It's all well labeled and everything. And you know, we take food security so seriously at our market. If you look over my wife's shoulder, you see there's a tank there. So we are literally ready for anything at the farmer's market. If they come for us, we're ready. Let's put it that way. But this was happening long before there was a Food Safety Modernization Act. We were already doing the right thing. And the work that we did was to make sure that that was recognized, and I think we accomplished that to a large degree. There are some who would disagree with the conclusion that we reached, but it's an important part of our whole movement. And the fourth thing I'd say is that, you know, in a healthy food system, we're engaged. Wendell Berry, I'm sure you recognize that quote, said, "Eating is an agricultural act." But it is also a political act. And I like to tell crowds, especially I talked at university last week, I like to tell students, I said, you know, every bite you take, and I would ultimately say every meal matters, it all goes into the political system. It all goes into the choices that are being made. It all goes into the way that our farms are going to look and what they are going to have available for their kids. And this is something that we have to keep saying over and over again. to the 80% of the people who really don't care where their food comes from, except they want it to be convenient and cheap, is that every meal matters, and it has an effect. It has an effect on the kind of country we have and on the health of its people. So, what else must farmers do? Well, I would say that we have to learn lessons of others who share our values from the past and the present, from around the world, and from different socioeconomic backgrounds. I'm just going to do a quick time check here. Okay, good. Because I'm going to show some pictures, okay? Because I like to travel, and so now you get to see some of my vacation photos. Because there are a lot of lessons out there to learn from around the world and from different peoples and from different parts of the food system. So I'm going to show you some examples of what I've learned. And I think we, in our focus on local, we have to remember that there's an awful lot out there. I wrote a series of articles called Beyond Local, because I think in many respects we have to move beyond that idea of local and realize that we really are one whole system. So this is in Havana, Cuba. And some of you probably know the story of what has happened there, and I could talk for a couple hours on that alone, and I won't. But this is a residential neighborhood in the outskirts of Havana, and this is a block of houses. The streets are lined with houses all the way around the block, and they have combined their backyards into one big farm, and they operate it as a cooperative, all the neighbors together. Now, why did they do this? Well, like I said, there's a long story, but the short story is that, well, we've had a 54-year, I know exactly how long because the revolution occurred the year I was born. There's been like a 54-year embargo on Cuba, and it has been difficult for them to get the products they need in order to farm. And then they became dependent on the Soviet Union in around 1990. The Soviet Union fell apart. And it was at that time when they really were the most desperate and hungry. So, you can say what you want about the politics of Cuba, but let's look at what people do when they're desperate. And this is part of the mystery of, well, how have they withstood all of the challenges down there that leaders in North Africa and the Middle East are having trouble with right now? Well, the Castro brothers knew that the people had to eat, and so they made it possible for people to create these cooperatives. They provided a lot of the infrastructure. You can see there's an irrigation system going down through the middle of that lettuce patch. That's provided by the government. And then they provided some policy. And if you ever doubt the ability of policy to change things, think about this. They just said, hey, if you're growing within 5 miles of the center of the city, we're not going to charge you any income tax at all on the food you sell. If you're within 10 miles, we're going to charge you 5% tax. If you're within 15 miles, we're going to charge you 10% tax. I mean, a third grader could have put this policy together. But the tax on the income increased as you went out from the center of the city. And so what it did is it immediately started generating massive food production in the city. And this is one example of that. This is the farm stand at that same farm. You can see there's a high rise in the back. And this is open space, probably was a city park. And there's hundreds of thousands of people living in those apartment buildings behind. This is an 8-acre farm that employs 55 farmers, and they all make 4 times the average national wage. They made farming, they created a policy that made farming not only easy but necessary, and they made it possible for those people to live at a higher standard of living. I mean, it's easier to do when you control all the wages, right? But through policy, they made it possible for people to be able to feed themselves, or a lot of this food is sold into the tourist industry, and that generates money for them to spend on other types of food and other things that they need. This is why Cuba still stands, because they found a way to feed themselves. Now this is in Costa Rica, and I only have one real quick point to make with 2 slides here. Those are obviously pigs. This is at Earth University in Costa Rica, and those pigs are grazing on sugarcane, which is the source of energy that they're being provided with. They're very healthy, obviously. And so where did the protein come from? Well, these are leguminous trees. Some of these are mulberry, which is readily available here in this country. Mulberry green stems ground up are 22% protein. So 22% protein turns out to be almost exactly perfect for hog production. And in addition to that, if you look, now they're doing this experimentally, so that's why they're all lined up here like in an orchard. But actually, if you look at those, if you look at the trunks of those trees, and those are cut back every year, and the green stems are taken and ground into a protein supplement, they will grow back on there. But look at those, and you could well imagine that those make very nice fence posts. So in a lot of places in Costa Rica, actually the fences are, and just the, the regular single-strand electric fence that we even use here for a lot of livestock production, are these trees, and they can go around the outside the perimeter and harvest the protein supplement off of them and still have the fence post left. But my thought on this is, so there's energy source and a protein source, and the hogs are doing well. So I come from Indiana, so if I say this, it's not those people out there that I'm criticizing, but my own people. Maybe we don't need any corn and soybeans. I mean, think about that. You're welcome to say that in the Ag Committee if you'd like. We'll see how that goes over. But if you drive through the Midwest, you're going to see an awful lot of corn and soybeans. And sometimes I just sit and think, do we need any of it? Could we actually develop a system that wouldn't need any of that and would be perennial instead of the what happens, the monocropping and the massive soil loss and the chemical leaching that goes down into the Gulf of Mexico. It's a thought. So who knows what this is? Machu Picchu, right? It's someplace that needs to be on your life list. If you've not been there, you need to go. This is the lost city of the Incas in Peru. An amazing place. It's in the most unfriendly of spots, and yet was a thriving city at one time. And you'll stand there and wonder, how did they live here? They didn't have horses, remember, until the Spanish came and slaughtered them, basically, and brought horses with them. How did they live? Well, this is over to the side of the city. This is the agricultural region of Machu Picchu. This is where urban farming began. In that kind of an inhospitable environment, and you can see the slope. So there are those terraces, and there's been a lot of mystery about how these were used over the years, but they're learning more all the time. And they recently, there was a research report that had dug into these terraces very deeply and found that not only were these for food production, but they were designed and built with incredible engineering. It's not just like a wall of stone and some dirt behind it. Actually, the structure well into the ground was designed in order to hold the hillside from massive floods, and not only to keep it from slumping, but to hold the water in place so that the crops could benefit from that water. There's no reservoir here where they can do irrigation. The terraces themselves had to hold the water. So there's an incredible structure. I mean, this is so amazing that, of course, we look at it and say, well, there must have been people from outer space that helped them do this. One of my favorite lines in all of music was written by Neil Young in the song Cortez the Killer, where he says, they built up with their bare hands what we still can't do today. And when you stand here, you will realize, and look at that, you realize, we can't do that. We don't know how to do that the way they did. And the year I was there, about a month later, there were massive floods that took out a major part of the modern city at the bottom of this mountain, but no damage up here because it was built that well. But there's something even more amazing in Peru. I don't know how many of you might have seen this before. This is called Moray, and it's near the city of Urubamba. You need to put this on your life list even ahead of Machu Picchu. You need to stand there and look at this and think about what happened here. Now, to give you some scale, there's a little black dot kind of in the middle at the top of the main circle. That's a person up there. This is huge, and this is one of 4 structures in this same place. This is the one that they've restored. So there are 4 structures that look about like this. Now, so what was this? Well, how about an agricultural research station? Is the most likely description. They have found, in soil samples, they have found evidence of over 6,000 varieties of just potatoes and corn that were grown here. And they have gone around with instruments and measured climate, and they have found that actually every climate zone in Peru is represented somewhere in this circle based on the slope of the land, the way the sun hits it or misses it, the elevation. They were able to develop over 6,000 varieties in this spot so that those seeds could go out to the rest of the country and be grown anywhere, where, and be adapted to wherever they needed to go. Some people are starting to call this was the first green revolution, because it was the product that came out of this facility that actually transformed Europe after this continent was discovered, right? Of course, all this was going on before it was discovered. But it was the foods that came back from the Western Hemisphere to Europe that transformed the culture there and eventually brought our people back over to dominate and take the land from the folks that were here before. This is amazing. I stood there for hours. You just look at it and you can cry looking at this and realize that we have major universities in this country now that don't have a single idea about how to generate new varieties of fruits and vegetables without splicing genes. It's gone. So these are some of the potatoes, some of the wares that are still there. There's still hundreds, if not thousands, of varieties of potatoes that you can find in the markets around Peru. And these are some of the same, a few different varieties, but these are naturally freeze-dried potatoes. So they not only perfected the generation of new varieties, but they did this freeze-drying. They laid the potatoes out, and people were assigned to manage the potatoes all winter long. And they would freeze at night, and in the morning they would thaw, and then people walked on them and squeezed all the moisture out of the potatoes, and then it repeated night after night after night. And after a month or so, they had these freeze-dried potatoes. They can be reconstituted, and they can be stored just like this for up to 6 years and reconstituted into all kinds of foods. They knew how to do this 500 years ago. Just amazing. And I threw a few slides in here from my most recent trip in Vietnam. This is the valley near the northern city of Sapa. And it's very early spring. I was there in April. But what I was amazed by is to stand there, and these are the native peoples, the Hmong peoples of Vietnam, and what you see there in this field is 3 sisters growing, which is something that they got from the natives here. And again, the first green revolution was the knowledge that was contained on this continent and went back over. And that's a hog building and a water buffalo building. You see those two together on almost every farm. And this is this is in Hanoi, and the streets are lined with food vendors that are sitting there making food out of fresh ingredients every day, and you can sit down on your little toy. These are toy plastic. These are like toy patio furniture that our kids use, but they're purchased there for people to sit on and eat at these sidewalk restaurants. And just down the sidewalk, you find where they are getting the ingredients, and this all came from fairly close by. I mean, you understand the concept of a food shed when you walk through the streets of Hanoi. And you also understand the concept of food sovereignty, because they're doing a whole lot of things that you cannot do here because of regulations. Look at the meat sitting out on the table there at on the left side. And I have some pictures I'm not going to show you that would gross you out of how meat is managed there. So, you know, I'm sure some of you do travel, but there's a lot for us to learn around the world that we can now bring back into our culture. A lot of it originated here. We need to sacrifice everything, compromise nothing, and insist on a genuinely new beginning. Time is short, folks, and we know that, but that's one of those messages we have to take out there. But here, you know, here's a point that I really want to make even more, and this has to do with the Farm Bill in particular. In farm policy in Washington or in Augusta or Harrisburg, you know, it's almost, well, it is cliche to talk about the fact that we're involved in a paradigm shift in this new food system. I mean, we've been talking about that for a long time, but what we haven't really talked about is, okay, so what does a real paradigm shift actually take? Well, one of the examples I like to use, because I used to study physics in college. I was going to be an astrophysicist. I was going to make bombs. I'm much happier growing potatoes. But the big, you know, one of the biggest scientific revolutions that ever occurred was the transition from a geocentric view of the universe, where it was thought that the Earth was in the middle and everything revolved around the Earth, and the heliocentric, which is where the sun is in the middle and everything revolves around that. Now, you know, today we know that, you know, even our solar system is part of a huge galaxy, and the galaxy is part of a cluster of galaxies, and so we have even a much bigger picture. But just that shift from, is the Earth in the middle or is the sun in the middle? And we can go out any night here and look at the night sky, and we could talk about the evidence that makes it obvious that the Earth is at the middle, or I mean the sun is at the middle of the solar system and not the Earth. It's you know, it's something we take for granted. You know, it took 300 years for the world's peoples to accept the idea that the sun was at the middle once it was introduced. And a lot of people were killed in the process for the heresy of saying that it was the other way around. 300 years it took. But you know why it took so long, in part, is because there was no compromise. It had to be one or the other. There is no, I mean, we could have sent it to Washington, and they could have worked on that, and we would have a compromise bill, you know, between the heliocentric and geocentric. But you know, the point being that in this case, it's really clear it had to be one or the other, and it took a long time to accept that, you know what, this old idea was wrong, and this new idea is closer to the truth. Well, we're really involved in the same kind of thing. We're really involved in changing a paradigm that is going to die that hard. But it is going to die, and we know that. And that's one of the things that we know that we have to spread out there, that we have to go out and tell people, is that, you know, fundamentally it comes down to this. Nature is not the enemy. And you know, it's not really the solution either. Because no matter what religious background or philosophical background or political background you come from, you know, there's one reality that we really can't get around, and that is the relationship between people and the planet that matters. That, you know, we can't idealize nature and say nature's going to, you know, take care of everything, but it's our relationship to it. And we know that. You as farmers know that. You know that it's your relationship to the land that matters and that brings forth food and that helps you to feed your families and your communities. We know that, and we know that that is the new paradigm that we have to get into Washington, into our state capitals, into the minds of our people, that we can no longer go on thinking that the way to solve the world's problems is to continue manipulating nature to try to get the result that we want. We have to step back, we have to learn what's there to learn, and we have to work with nature to come out with the result, the only result that ultimately will be sustainable. I like to talk about, with regard to the Farm Bill, the Sustainable Farm Bill paradox, which is that, you know, for farms to truly be sustainable, they really should not be depending on federal funds. You know, we really can't talk about sustainability if we're getting federal money to keep our farms together. At the same time, there are real needs. We need roads, we need market infrastructure. If you ask farmers, they know what we need. What's missing? It's infrastructure, right? It's the meat packing plants, it's the collection points, it's the distribution systems. It's the infrastructure that the industrial system ripped apart. We need that, and that's where we need the focus of federal money and federal policy. But we're not going to get there in an evolutionary way. This Farm Bill is not going to tweak and change a little bit this time and a little bit more in 5 years and a little bit more 5 years after that and eventually come out with the result we want. So I'm just going to say this because I believe it's true. We have to dismantle the whole thing and start over. At some point, we will have to do that. And we have to start over with a different vision. And we have to start over with a vision that is based on the paradigm that we all understand and promote. We have to organize ourselves locally, regionally, nationally in order to develop and promote a credible, farmer-driven vision of the food systems we wish to see and believe are possible. There's some key words there I'm going to cover pretty quickly. It has to be farmer-driven. We can't let other people speak for farmers. As farmers, we need to be organized and we need to be generating the vision. We need to be the ones speaking on behalf of the agricultural community. And I would say we actually have to speak on behalf of the food system. And we're not organized that well. MOFGA is very well organized. PASA is very well organized. But this is what I said at the beginning. We have to understand that we have to come together and find a way to provide a national voice for the paradigm shift that we know has to happen. It has to be credible, and this goes back to the idea of we can't be dependent on hidden crutches, in the Farm Bill, for instance. We have to be honest with ourselves about what actually works, what actually is profitable, what actually is generating income to make the food system work and continue working. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as small. And this is one of those things where I'm the voice out crying in the wilderness when I go to Washington. I tell my colleagues, I said, don't be talking about small farms. There's nothing small about what we're doing. And as soon as you use that term, as soon as you're sitting with a group of policymakers and you start talking about small farms, the entire conversation is about small farms. You're no longer talking about the food system. You're no longer talking about the big change that has to occur. You're talking about cute little small farms that need a little bit of federal assistance in order to keep going. It happens in an instant. And you can't get out of that rut once you're there. We have to stop using that term small. We have to be concerned about the treatment of farm workers. Or, that may not be such a big issue around here, but how about the people that we hire to run our markets? How are they treated? Are they getting a living wage? Do they get paid vacation time? Do they get health benefits? Think about that. That's something that we need to be concerned about, and we need to be honest with ourselves about. We need to be honest in providing outreach to less fortunate communities and groups of people. We have to be responsible for what's happening in those urban areas. I mean, it was good to see about different, urban farming models last night. But the fact is, as farmers, we need to be responsible for what's happening in those urban areas. That's our business. We need to understand what it's going to take to feed those people and to feed them in a way that they can afford, and to feed them in a way that provides a just supply of food for all peoples. And we need to be honest and diligent in developing strategies about how the world is going to be fed. Because here's another thing we know. We know that industrial farming is not the way to feed the world. That's what we hear all the time, that actually it's going to take industrial farming to feed the world, and that's why we can't have all this organic and sustainable stuff and think it's going to be a hill of beans. But what we know is that the world's peoples, and when you travel like I have, you will see that the only way people are going to be fed is if they have local agriculture that they can depend on and that they can participate in. It might be a better word to say than depend. So we have, that's the credibility we need to bring to it, and we need to organize. We need to provide the vision. Sustainable organic farm leaders around the country need to be involved in generating the vision, that farmer-driven vision of the food system that we want. And we need to insist on it. We need to stay with that, and we need to keep making the point that we're not going to tweak this farm bill to get what we want. We're going to have to start over, and this is the vision that we need to have in order to put it together right. We need to be the leaders of that. And ultimately, again, we need to remember where we come from. I'm going to come back to that point. I said I would. So, I'll put my theological hat back on. There's a lot of talk about bad things in the Bible, and, there's lots of curses. Starting with that big one, with the fall. You are cursed, you will have to farm now. You will have to raise your food. But almost nowhere, I say almost nowhere because I haven't actually examined every example, but it could be that nowhere in Scripture do you find a place where a curse is mentioned without also the solution or the blessing being right there with it. In fact, it kind of becomes the path. The curse becomes the path to the blessing. So, I was thinking about Forrest Gump this morning, and the line about life is like a box of chocolates. And I've always wondered, what is it that bothered me about that line? What's wrong with it? And I figured out this morning, because I had that extra hour. I woke up, at the normal time and had an hour to lay there and think. So, the problem with that line is that, with a box of chocolates, you have a bunch of good things that have even other good stuff inside. But life is not like that. Life is a whole bunch of bad things. And sometimes when you squeeze it, there's good stuff inside. And that's really kind of what the message, you go back to Genesis, that the message there is that, not that, you've been banished from the garden, but it's all about attitude. And I would submit that this audience knows what I'm talking about. Farming is a curse. And I could take you down to Pennsylvania right now and show you fields that this year have evidence in the same field of drought and flood and wind and early snowfall. And the farmers are still hoping to get a crop out of it somehow. Farming is cursed, but farming is a blessing at its heart, and we know that. And we know that the only way to get to that blessing is to go through the curse. And when I think about my friend Vine Deloria and the Native American view of all this, I'd say that, he talked about lines and circles. I would say we have to bend our lines back into circles. And that's something that MOFGA and PASA does very well. We need to teach other people that. And I don't mean to say that other groups don't know how to do that. I'm just saying I think we do it remarkably well and can provide leadership. We must find a way to use that experience to transform the world. We must take the line of history and bend it into a circle of sustainability before it's too late. Thank you very much.